Good evening, and thank you for joining in. I'm Nina Kler, and I'm so excited to be collaborating with Raghu from the Minds Foundation to celebrate our version of DaanUtsav by giving our time talking about important topics. So, today we're going to be talking about workplace well being. So, whether you work full time, part time, you're a gig worker, or you follow the hybrid model, your workplace is definitely going to affect your mental health. So, to help us understand the landscape of well being at the workplace through the lens of mental health, we have with us three wonderful luminaries from their field: Abhijit Bhaduri, Gopi Krishnaswamy, and Dr. Raghu Appasani. So, if Viha, you could bring them on stage, we can begin our conversation after I give their lengthy bios. So I didn't know how to do justice. I could not do justice. I had to slash, I had to cut out a whole lot, and then I had to run it by you guys because I wanted to know if I did justice to you guys or not. But to begin with, Abhijit, he is a very accomplished HR leader. And I have to read this because it's really long. He's an executive coach, an absolute authority in the HR world with a phenomenal following across social media with more than 8 lakh followers on LinkedIn alone. His LinkedIn newsletter has nearly 250,000 subscribers. He was the chief learning officer of the Wipro Group for 7 years. Abhijit has an incredibly creative side too. He's an artist and has authored multiple books. And ladies and gentlemen, he has an amazing podcast called Dreamers and Unicorns. The list is endless, and he has taken the time out for us right now after just recording another podcast. So welcome, Abhijit. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me, Nina. It's always lovely to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Now over to Gopi Krishnaswamy. He is somebody I love. He is over and above everything else, straight from the heart. He's one of the kindest souls that I know. So Gopi is a mindfulness coach and the regional lead for Google's world-famous Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute. He's done the whole C-suite gig and was the managing director for IDEO, the iconic design company. Today, he works at the confluence of mindfulness, creativity, leadership, and well-being, and is the author of the bestseller Creativity Unleashed, which I have somewhere, but I don't know where it is. Otherwise, I would have flashed it right now for you guys. So thank you for joining in, Gopi. A real pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Nina. Always a pleasure to be here with you. And I must say that was a very, very kind and generous introduction. I hope I can live up to the expectations that you've already set. Very, very high.
Thank you so much. In fact, Gopi, I was thinking maybe later, if we have time, that I'm going to request you to at least do a 2-minute meditation with us, because I would love for everybody to experience the beautiful space that you hold. So thank you so much for joining in. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Raghu Appasani, who is the CEO and founder of the Minds Foundation, a psychiatrist, a neuroscientist, and an ardent mental health advocate, and my partner in crime when it comes to celebrating DaanUtsav with such a bang. I mean, Raghu, I think the list is endless. When I think of you, I think of the word experimental. So hopefully in tomorrow's conversation, we're going to see that side of you as well. So thank you so much for doing this. You drive me crazy. You drive me crazy, crazy, crazy. But thank you for doing this with me.
Really the feeling excited. Is mutual.
Oh my God.
But it's a good one. It's good. And it's good. And no, it's also been really incredible to work with you and to meet folks like Gopi and Abhijit as well, who are just incredible. So thanks for your ability to curate such conversations.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to kick off the panel with my first conversation to you, Raghu. So I think it's very important for us to understand that why is it even important for us to be aware of mental health in the workplace?
Yeah, it is definitely a very important topic, and a lot of us are speaking about it quite a bit. And if we think about it, as a kid, we spend most of our time in school, and we focus a lot on mental health and physical health in the academic setting. But then as we continue to grow and develop into adults, we start to spend more of our time in the workplace. And in modern society, there's less of a divide now between the workplace and the home. And we, as we were backstage prior to this, you were talking about how you're glued to your phone and it's your best friend, which can be a bit problematic, right? And it's hard to create those boundaries. So I would argue, actually, first we need to take a look at what the definition, or we have to look at a new definition of what the workplace means. And it's not the standard sitting in an office anymore. So we really need to look at, is it working at home? Is it working in cafes? How do we now create environments that can bring positive mental health and physical well-being to one's, emotional state as they're engaging in something they should be passionate about at the end of the day? So it's important, and it's the responsibility of not just the individual, but of the actual curators of that environment, whether it's from everyone from the architect to the governments that create those spaces to also the managers that are involved. So it is really important for us to think about, because it has a direct correlation not only with productivity of the individual, but about their relationship with each other and also at their relationship at home.
I don't know, Raghu, whether people really think about what you mentioned, the last sentence that you said in terms of with each other. I think that's one very big missing piece. And I'd love to come back to you later and maybe have you elaborate on that. So Gopi, my question to you, it's a long one. It's in 2 parts, and I'd love for you to elaborately answer on it. That workplaces have been thought of as tough environments, essentially, right? So is that true? And what has changed now to bring about a focus on workplace well-being? And the second part is, how does this aspect of workplace well-being connect with work-life balance, like Raghu was mentioning?
Yeah, I actually love what Raghu was saying, in the sense that I think workplaces have really evolved, have really transformed. I think the very idea of a workplace maybe came about sometime around the Industrial Revolution, when a lot of people started getting together in one place and doing something for an output. And while we moved from there into the knowledge economy and all of that, I think some of the core ideas of workplaces remain fairly static. They didn't really evolve as we evolved, in a sense, as the world evolved, as business evolved. So ideas around how workplaces should be remain fairly static, if you ask me. So focus was on productivity, on efficiency. And with that came the idea that workplaces had to be tough. People had to be monitored. People had to be pushed to achieve certain goals. But as Raghu also said, workplaces today have changed. We're working from so many different places. We're working from home, we're working from cafes, hybrid models, and what have you. And in this kind of a setting, workplaces are not just about surviving. Workplaces have to be conducive to thriving because of the kind of work that we do. If they are not conducive to our thriving and we're only focused on surviving, then the quality of our work is going to be dramatically different. So I think, in a sense, the idea of work-life balance itself came about because we thought work was tough, work sucked. So we needed life to kind of bring about the balance. But if you look at the fact that today we're working, definitely more than a third of our day, more than 8 hours, maybe even 50% of the day. And it's very fluid. We're not like working for exactly 8 or 10 hours and then we stop. Information is always at us and it's flowing. So all the more reason we cannot really think of work and life as separate things, and that only life will give us the balance that work doesn't. It's important that both work and life, in fact, there is for me no separation. I think there's just life. And in life, there has to be balance. And if that can be, a paradigm shift for us, If we can achieve that paradigm shift, I think we're well on our way to already kind of making the workplace a good deal better. So kind of a long answer to your long question, Nina, but I hope it kind of made sense of that.
Sorry, I was muted. Do you see the shift happening, Gopi?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I certainly see the shift happening. I think, as always, there are the, early innovators, then, the followers are later. The majority comes in later. But you can certainly see the inflection has started. More progressive companies. I mean, in the last year itself, there are a whole bunch of progressive companies, I think, who declared like permanent work from home and stuff like that. So I certainly think this inflection has started.
Okay. Thank you, Gopi. Abhijit, now coming to you, I'd want you to bring your very sharp HR lens to this question, please. So, like we all have been talking, the fact that the world has changed forever, right? The hybrid model is becoming popular, but keeping in mind one's mental health, I'd like you to talk a little bit about its challenges through the lens of well-being.
Sure. So thanks, Nina. I think one of the ways to look about it is, we talked a little bit earlier, some of the previous speakers have talked about the shift from the, agrarian to the industrial revolution. And a lot of the practices have really been driven by practices which are like almost 100, 200 years old. But one of the things to keep in mind is when we shifted work into the home, there's another piece that is very important. You see, when we went to an office to work, there was a start time and there was an end time. Yes, of course, some people did have to take calls, but there was a commute time. So the commute time, both to and fro, actually prepared you to, prepared your mind and your body to say that, okay, now I'm going to work, and then you finish it and then you come back. Now, when you change only one variable, which is the workplace, you brought it home, the other piece also needs to be fixed, which is the start time and the end time. So you kind of see that a lot of people take fake commutes so that they are able to tell their body that, okay, I'm now getting into work, etc. But I think in the absence of that, work moving in home is actually fairly devastating, because that's one of the places you are isolated. Yes, you can connect with everybody online, but think about it. What if you were told that you can only meet your family members on video and you would never see them again? And in fact, some of the people are living through those times. So when you do that, I mean, human beings crave that connection. So I think the workplace needs to look at places where we can connect safely. That goes without saying. But also, on the other hand, I think more importantly, in the quest for productivity, we sometimes say that, okay, you were commuting any case, so that time goes to the employer. You're commuting back home, that time goes to the employer. So you've added a couple of extra hours. So I'm not surprised when people proudly say productivity has gone up. Actually, people are working very many longer hours. And now it's not unusual for somebody to say, okay, we'll have this meeting at 10 o'clock. So I think those kind of changes have to be brought in. And this has nothing to do just with the workplace, but it's just, as I said, that you have to look at work, worker, and workplace as a sort of these three circles are interlinked. So if the workplace has changed, the nature of work and the workforce, those kind of models also need to change. Without that, I think you are going to continue to see that we replace one pandemic, which we are going through, with another pandemic of mental health. So I worry about that a lot.
I think, Abhijit, the pandemic of mental health has always been there. It's being highlighted a whole lot more, and it's probably being escalated and it's growing exponentially. So when you're talking about, the fact that there are no boundaries, I feel it. Sitting at home, I don't go anywhere. I'm working at home and there's no break. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. It's everybody at this point. So Raghu, I'd want you to hop in here now, please, and give your expert suggestions on what can be done to enhance mental health in the workplace.
Definitely. And, the first thing is I would love to meet someone who works only 8 hours a day, because I don't know the last time I have been able to do that. And that's the problem also, I think. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up that we can do to really change mental health, right, is many of us have been trained in a way that if you have a leadership role, that you should be presenting in a certain way, that you shouldn't be expressing any type of negative emotions or struggles, and that you have to be almost like a stoic rock that's there, and maybe even a bit of an aggressive leader. Now, the problem with that is that there's a lot of unexpressed emotions that happen that can inhibit the constructive nature of actually being productive and being creative in the workplace. And so we have a lot of these stigmas that need to be broken down, and these stereotypes of what it is to be a leader, what it is to be male, what it is to be a female leader even. And what I would encourage people in these positions to do, and this is a simple change that can really change the whole environment of mental health, is start to actually express what you're feeling to your team and to your employees and to your mentees. And what that will do is actually start to have them recognize that you're actually human again and bring back a sense of that. And as Abhijit was saying, we crave connection. We're humans, we're organisms at the end of the day, and we crave connection. We're not meant to be alone. And so this simple act of actually expressing, what you're thinking, what you're feeling, and not hiding that from the rest of your team will start to actually bring that human connection and allow others to build that connection. And at the end of the day, it helps build more resilience. And so when obstacles come towards your team, you can overcome them together, and people won't feel so alone or so scared. And so that's really the difference, right? So that's one simple thing that can be done by anyone in any form of leadership position. And every single individual is in a form of leadership to at least one other person, right? In some form. So I would encourage people just to start to speak a little bit more openly about it, and to create some space, and just to check in a bit more frequently also with their employees. And these are the things that can really change the dynamic. And, I know I'm speaking for a bit, but just to kind of put one more point to this, with Minds Foundation, for example, our team is very remote, as you know, and with the COVID pandemic as well, we were a bit isolated, and people are dealing with their own family members struggling with mental health or with COVID, for example. And it became a bit challenging for me as the CEO of the organization as well to say, I can't physically be there with this person, but what can I do? And for me, the one thing I could do was just starting to set up much more frequent check-ins on a one-on-one basis with every single individual, right? And even expressing publicly how this pandemic is affecting me personally too. So just bring back that human connection.
Wonderful. And Raghu, I'm so happy that you spoke about it so elaborately, because you set the stage now perfectly for the topic of mindful leadership, I feel, somewhere. And that's actually how I met Gopi, I think, when I started exploring the world of mindful leaders. And like in my introduction, I spoke about Gopi and how he's done the whole C-suite gig. I would love for you, Gopi, to the fact that you've worked with so many leaders, I'd want you to sort of bring your perspective on how can we think of well-being in the context of leadership. Please bring your mindful leadership hat on, Gopi.
So I think, both Abhijit and Raghu have made some great points here about, humans and connection. And I think one of the key things about leadership is that it's not static. Sometimes as a leader, you're leading from the front, and that's when you are probably able to see with clarity. You have a vision, you communicate it to your team, and then you say, okay, I can see this, so follow me. And there is a time and place for that. But then today we also work with incredibly smart people. So one can't always be leading from the front. Sometimes you're also saying, now it's time for you to take over, and I'm just here to hold the space for you. Right? So that has to change. Your leadership style has to change. And not just that, I think it was Gandhi who said, "There go my people. I must follow them, for I'm their leader." So sometimes as a leader, you're even a follower. And how do you kind of flow between these different states of leadership? You have to be aware. You have to be aware of what's going on. You have to be aware of people around you. You have to be aware of emotions. And that's, in a sense, for me, how mindfulness starts to play into leadership. It starts to directly impact your emotional intelligence as a leader. And today, as we all know, I think, that's one of the key aspects of leadership. We often see a lot of really smart, high IQ leaders taking bad decisions, because burnt out minds lead to bad decisions. So mindfulness brings about the kind of emotional intelligence that is required for situational leadership today. And in the context of building high performance teams as well, I think there's a lot to be said about aspects of trust, psychological safety. I think many of us have heard of the famous Project Aristotle, which was done in Google, where they studied thousands of teams across the company to see what was the one single factor that contributed to high performing teams. And while clarity of vision was important, multidisciplinary skills were important, leadership was important. At the end of the day, the single most important factor was psychological safety, which meant that the team felt safe with each other. They felt safe to take risks, make mistakes, knowing that they were supported. And psychological safety is a direct outcome of empathy, which in turn feeds straight into mindfulness. So, of course, Nina, you know me, I'm biased. For me, all roads lead to Rome and mindfulness. But that apart, there's certainly a lot to be said about mindfulness in leadership and high-performing teams today.
No, I think that's brilliant. And I honestly didn't realize the fact that psychological safety, I know personally, but I didn't realize there's so much research out there in terms of that psychological safety is such an important, integral part of creating trust in leadership. So thank you for highlighting that, Gopi. And Abhijit, now coming to you, we've spoken quite a bit personally about gig working. So gig working hasn't ever been this popular as it is thanks to the pandemic. But while it has its perks, it also has perils. So I'd like you to talk about how the well-being of gig workers can be ensured. And I know gig is one of your favorite words, Abhijit, so over to you.
Yes, I'm going to start with a quick distinction. So I think gig workers and freelancers are two different groups. Even though we use the word interchangeably for convenience, gig workers are people you hire through a platform. So the platform assigns an individual, and the service is more important than the individual. So when you order food, who delivers the food is not as important as the fact that you want the food delivered. So that's your gig worker. And then you could also have white collar jobs being done through platforms, and there are plenty of those. So you could do that. But I think the important piece is that freelancers are people who directly reach their consumers. So there is no intermediary, either a platform or any other organization. So those are the freelancers. I think when you look at both freelancers and gig workers, I think one of the major challenges is when you are a gig worker, the uncertainty. When you are an employee, you have a fixed salary. You could take a day off. You could do all this. As a gig worker, you always feel vulnerable about whether there is going to be adequate amount of money at the end of the month. So I think this uncertainty, this slow anxiety that you live with all the time, regardless of what kind of gig work you do, when you're a freelancer or a gig worker, regardless, you are constantly waiting to get the next assignment. This anxiety and slow burn actually is terrible for your mental health. Number two, I think when you look at the, for a lot of people, when they start out on their own, I think they, need to have the support of some kind of a place which assures a minimum guarantee, if you will, and that's missing. So I think that's another difficult piece for the gig workers to actually handle, whether you're a freelancer or a gig worker. The third element is, when you think about the opportunities to actually talk to a colleague, the opportunities to get insurance, the opportunity to get medical care which somebody takes care of. I think these are all expenses that gig workers have exactly at the same level as employed people. So being able to sort of manage those kind of pieces also takes a toll, because people stress about how much do they spend, for their day-to-day expenses, and what do they do to plan for the future. This uncertainty is actually one of the big drivers of challenges for mental health. Having said that, it's in no way different, because I think in organizations we've so far looked at well-being and mental health as a perk. Actually, I think it's a skill because it can be learned. People can learn to have more empathy with others. But I also think that, particularly in the organizations, when I am part of an organization that works in this space, and their entire research actually shows very categorically that even inside the organization, the mid-level managers are the ones who are worst affected in this pandemic, because they have to constantly juggle their life between the two ends of the spectrum. So I think, yes, gig workers and freelancers have their own challenges from the uncertainty point of view. When it comes to the middle managers who are employed, even though they don't have the uncertainty of salaries, but I think they also experience the uncertainty of relationships, having to manage two ends of the spectrum, and they're constantly having to second guess. And that also is responsible for the slow kind of, stress, the low level stress that you experience constantly, and which is terrible for mental health. So I think all in all put together, I think, which is why we are beginning to see that there is a huge rise in, the cases of mental health challenges, and the organizations actually also becoming conscious of it. But I think we have a lot more to do.
Nina, actually, off of that, I just wanted to add something. So, Abhijit, I love what you said, and Gopi as well. And one of the things that it made me think a lot about, that I've been contemplating and writing and trying to figure out exactly how to, write this piece, is around the impact of neoliberalism on mental health, right? So we've kind of come back to this concept of neoliberalism, which leads to the gig economy in some way, where now there's no boundary, and you go to work, you punch in, punch out. The commodity has changed to now be us. And so putting in that extra hour or extra 2 hours in the middle of the night, and, burning that candle at 2 a.m. we've sort of like glamorized it almost. And that's where the problem comes in, because then we actually start to depreciate the value of who we are too. And we see ourselves as the commodity. Not as this provider that's bringing a unique skill, for example. So I think that's a concept that really needs to change as well. And I can't agree with you more on this impact of the middle manager. That's probably the worst position that anyone can be in. And you can't please everybody around you, and you're just faced and bombarded. And this idea that we are living in modern society in a state of chronic stress, right? And we're having chronic stress hormones being released and causing inflammation and leading to mental health conditions. And, it's a little bit difficult to recognize, because we're not seeing overt, like one mental health, acute stressor occurring, but we're living in a state of just heightened anxiety as a society. So it's very important for us to address that in this context.
Actually, Raghu, I'll just sort of add one small piece here. If you think about it, even the people who are employed, we did talk about the fact that, the freelancers, gig workers have this whole challenge of the uncertainty. Actually, even the people who are employed today, there are business models being changed at such a rapid pace. Everybody has a certain degree of uncertainty about continued employment. Their skills are becoming obsolete. The stuff that they've done for years no longer is relevant for people. But I also think that one other factor to keep in mind is, a lot of people, you talked about neoliberalism, but I think the biggest myth is that, people say, oh, the, gig workers can work, they have flexibility, they can work anytime that they like. That's a myth, because, your cab driver probably has to work 18 hours in order to just make enough money to be able to make ends meet. So this question of flexibility is a great sort of PR line that we have fed to people, thinking that gig workers have a tremendous degree of flexibility. They can work at 2 a.m. at night. That's because they have to.
Yes, I think it's a myth. And Abhijit, I'm stuck at what you said when you mentioned the word uncertainty and vulnerability, because I'm a freelancer and I appreciate the fact that you distinguish between a gig worker and a freelancer, because very often people don't realize the difference. So I feel that on a regular basis, the vulnerability, the uncertainty about, will I get the next job? Will I get the next recording? You know what I'm saying? So I appreciate that you highlighted that. And Raghu, the whole glamour part, I love how you put it, because we really have glamorized getting exhausted. And I have to share, to be honest, Dr. Alok Chopra will be joining us tomorrow, as you know, and he's my doctor. When he asked me to have a bunch of tests done for my cortisol and my DHEA, a part of me felt like, oh my goodness, wow, Nina, actually you do have adrenal fatigue, and I shouldn't be proud of it. But a part of me is glorifying the fact in my head that, oh my God, I actually have adrenal fatigue and I should be ashamed of myself, because I'm supposed to be a well-being crusader, Raghu. So and that brings me to my next question for you, which is based on the fact that we're online all the time, right? So given the rise of being on social media constantly, right, and technology, do these companies have a responsibility to invest in community mental health? If you could unmute yourself and unleash yourself.
Okay. I mean, the answer is yes. I believe they do, because you can make profit while doing good. And we know that's a proven model for a successful and an effective business at this point. So I do believe that there is community and social responsibility from companies, because you're deriving so much from employees and from your environment. So you should be giving back to enhance that environment, right? So, I mean, it's very fitting you asked this question this week while, Facebook had the whistleblower come out, and a lot of research coming out about how they knowingly are aware, right, of the impact of technology on teenagers, specifically on female adolescents. And they have this data, and there is a responsibility to take care. And I'm not against technology and social media at all. I think that what should be invested in is in the education of enhancing, creating a more appropriate relationship between an individual and their technology use, and to not get to a state where someone says, my cell phone is my best friend, not to pick on you, Nina, but to develop a healthy relationship. And so there is definitely 100% responsibility for these companies and for individuals to invest in this.
I have to say, Raghu, I mean, it's something that I've noticed thanks to the pandemic, that, I mean, there was a time prior to the pandemic, pre-pandemic times, that I actually had a life, but now it's this want, this need to constantly be connected. And I think you made a very valid point. It is their responsibility. It really is. So thank you for highlighting that. And now, Gopi, coming to you, hop back onto your whole creativity piece. And you've written a book, right, called Creativity Unleashed, which I did I name it in the beginning? Yes, I did. So you advocate mindfulness and well-being as ways of enhancing creativity. Can you elaborate a bit on that, please? And I'm sure that Abhijit will also enjoy this answer. It'll bring the creative genius in him out. So over to you, Gopi, if you could please unmute yourself.
I'm afraid I may not have an answer, and I'll try to respond. Because there's bits and pieces we've already been talking about, which is really nice, because it's come out so organically. We've already been talking about adrenal fatigue. We've been talking about how typically workplaces have been constructed in a certain way, and I mean, I've seen workplaces myself. I've been a part of workplaces myself where, you had to be there late every day to demonstrate that you were working hard or working well. And it's unfortunate that somehow these behaviors got connected to, one's creativity or one's productivity. If you multitasked, you were considered really cool or efficient. And I actually say, when you're multitasking, you're doing multiple tasks equally badly at the same time. So if you look at the way things have been constructed, it's a lot of the focus is on, adrenaline, is on deadlines, is on multitasking. And the interesting part is that none of these really support creativity consistently or in the long run. I mean, let's just stop here and think about it for a minute. Just reflect in your own life. When have you had your aha moments? Have they been when someone's had a gun to your head? Or have they been when, you've been out for a walk in the midst of nature, or perhaps even having a shower? In fact, there is a phrase, they say shaving moment, which some of us, I think, clean-shaven men actually experience, because it's a moment of mindfulness. It's, you're not thinking too much. You have to be careful, otherwise you'll nick yourself. So it's in that state that you actually have your creative aha moments. So while we've created this whole belief that, we need to multitask and we need to be rushing around and, be on the edge all the time to be productive, that's actually counterproductive. And it goes against the fundamentals of creativity. Whether it's neuroscience or, our own lives, there's enough evidence now to suggest that creativity actually happens in kind of relaxed moments. And therefore, again, like I said, all roads lead to Rome. Mindfulness is a great way of allowing yourself to experience these aha moments. In a sense, basically being in the present moment, not obsessing with the future or drowning in the past. You're freeing your mind of the shackles, and in a sense getting out of the way so that your creativity can manifest itself.
Thank you, Gopi. Abhijit, would you like to add to that? You have to unmute yourself, Abhijit.
Sorry. I completely resonate with what Gopi just said, that when you look at this obsession with productivity, and simultaneously organizations sort of say that, we like our employees to be innovative, we want them to come with creative ideas. Think about it. I mean, where are you likely to find creativity is when, people who, why do writers hang around in these, dingy coffee shops and they chat, evidently with no rhyme or reason? So it just seems like a royal waste of time, So, but at the same time, this is how the ideas happen. That you talk about something completely inane, and then somebody builds on that, and then you riff on that particular thing, and then somebody scribbles something, and then you get inspired by that. So creativity is not a linear process, so it's not a process of efficiency, because you need that white space. Organizations, when they are looking at people to get curious, to learn about things, and yet they keep saying that we want leaders to be learning agile, we want them to be growing. If you don't provide that free space, then it's not going to happen. And in an organization, as both other speakers have alluded to this, it's somehow glamorized that, you work 10 hours, then you are good, but you know what, I work 12, I'm better. So I think as long as this, very completely archaic notion of who's a more valuable employee, the longer you work, and then you find leaders sort of talking about the fact that, oh, I just need to sleep for 3 hours and I'm like really there. You aren't. I mean, which explains why so many people take foolish decisions, because they are so brain dead. So I think these are some of the myths that need to be brought to light, so that people begin to understand that this is not something. It depends. If you are looking to have, the widget manufacturer somebody standing on the assembly line, maybe you tweak up the clock a little bit, you get one more widget out of that. But you don't get one more idea out of a person by doing just that. So actually with human beings, it works the other way around. You have, more relaxed environment, people are far more creative, which is why, children who are, the most sort of hard to rein in and discipline are the ones who are most creative. They'll be drawing because they want to draw. They'll continue drawing. You tell them to draw within that square, they'll draw outside the square. So, the ability to experiment, break the norms, to have that freedom to try it out and build it back again quickly if, everything comes apart. I mean, those are important elements of being creative. So I think we have to make choices that you can either get productivity or you can get creativity.
I also want to clarify one thing, right? Is that we're speaking a lot about general workplace, and I think a lot of us are referring to traditional corporate setting for the most part. As a psychiatrist, someone working in healthcare, I will say that the healthcare system is probably one of the worst places to embrace mental health and well-being. The types of hours that physicians and other healthcare professionals have to go through in their training, right? Doing 24, 36, 48-hour shifts, like covering, come on, what kind of decisions are you making at that point, right? And the fact that physicians, at least in the United States, have the highest rate of suicide is terrible. I mean, it's shameful. So even within that system, things need to change as well. So I just wanted to clarify that because we're not getting it right either. So this is not just a one industry problem. I mean, this is a widespread pandemic that's happening.
Raghu, I was going to come to you in any case because I definitely want to ask you one question. You're running this foundation, and I know you're doing a bunch of things simultaneously, right? And you're doing something right because the foundation is growing. There's wonderful stuff happening. But like, Gopi and Abhijit both have said, and you've agreed, that you sort of need that space. When do you find the space to be creative, to go on doing what you're doing? Because I know you're burning the midnight oil. When do you find the time?
Yeah, it's difficult. I will say that the shaving technique is actually quite useful, as Gopi mentioned. You can notice when I'm not being as mindful because it'll tend to grow a little bit out of control. But what I've been a lot more intentional about is honestly getting myself out into nature. And that's one of the most important things for me is it forces me to truly disconnect. And I go out, I have very specific spots actually for this. And I go out, I meditate, I take a journal with me, and it's complete disconnection from everything. Turn my phone off. And so that's been really important for me. And then I have been trying as much as possible in the evenings at a certain time to put my auto response on my phone. And I've also been doing this technique called grayscale, which basically gets all the color out of your phone and turns it into a gray appearing screen. So you're not as inclined to use your cell phone. So that's been really important for me. And, one thing was on Monday when Facebook and servers went down and Instagram was down was really interesting, right? I mean, I think that I realized how productive I could be without those distractions. So, but for me, it's this technique of Shinrin Yoku, which is forest bathing and really getting myself in nature and disconnecting from tech. And I try to do that at least once a week, but definitely a few times a week if I can.
Thanks, Raghu. And I think, Gopi, I'd want to highlight over here the fact everybody should know we're encroaching on Gopi's bedtime. He had to take a power nap to join us. But thanks, Raghu. But I think the irony there is really stark, right? You're from the healthcare space, and we're talking about workplace well-being, and the healthcare workers are supposed to be able to take care of themselves. And one ends up burning the midnight oil. But thank you for the work that you do, Raghu. It's amazing. And it's so wonderful to keep seeing the foundation grow. So Abhijit, I want to focus a little bit on gender. That's something we haven't spoken about, right? So thanks to the pandemic, there are challenges that women are facing specifically. So I'd want you to highlight what are the challenges that women are facing at this point when it comes to well-being and the workplace.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's a great question. When you look at many of the roles which at home, caregiving roles traditionally do end up being done by women. Across cultures. This is not just India, but I mean talking worldwide. More women take up roles which are caregiving roles, whether it is looking after the husband or the children or aging family members who are there, or people who are unwell. A lot of times in the family that gets done predominantly by the woman. So when the pandemic struck, there's a lot of people. The kids were at home. You've got the aging people at home, or people who are unwell who need medical attention. All of that, for many women, it was impossible to therefore continue. So many of them dropped out of the workforce in larger numbers. LinkedIn just released a survey where they were talking about the fact that when you look at the top 25 startups, many of them have a very, very small number of women out there, because now you can always explain it and say that, okay, there are lesser number of women who are getting into engineering colleges, therefore the talent pipeline is low. But I think a bigger challenge is that a number of times, even if they do join the workforce, when they take a break, it becomes progressively harder and harder for them to come back. So it's a combination of many factors, and the pandemic has been especially brutal on multiple counts. One is, I think you see a greater rise in issues around domestic violence at home. You also see that more women have dropped out because there's no other way that you can help the kids with, especially if they are young. The schools insist that one of the parents join the kid as the classes are going on, because the kids are not able to focus. So to help them with the homework, to help them with the class, to help them, do their projects, etc. And add to it the task of managing home, etc. Guess what gets dropped off? It's the woman's own career. So when you look at that, progressively you will see that as a repeating pattern. And that, I think, is the tragedy that we have seen more often than not, during the pandemic. So I think from the point of view of mental health, I mean, I think the example that Raghu did, I would sort of really say that, ask yourself that if you had a pilot, who has sort of flown a plane for 48 hours at a stretch, and is ready to do another transatlantic journey for another 24 hours, would you trust the plane with that pilot? If the answer is no, then it's worth asking, why do we believe that people in the workspaces can perform these superhuman feats? And it's actually hard. It burns them out, and it's actually counterproductive. It's bad for creativity. It's bad for the health. It's bad for their effectiveness. So then, what are we really getting out of this entire process? And I think sometimes we're just stuck with this whole glamorous notion that somebody says, "Oh, I'm a CEO because I have to work 18 hours a day." Again, in some countries they talk about this 996. You're sort of working 12 hours a day. You're working 6 days a week, and you're sort of doing this all the time. This whole business just has to stop, because effectively, when these leaders promote this, it's just for another method for them to add another billion to their coffer. It is just not doing anything for the workers.
Thank you, Abhijit. I think I want to also have Raghu jump in over here and talk about, when we're talking about women and the fact that there's domestic violence. I think I want you to touch upon that, Raghu. We're talking about mental health and in terms of what women are suffering when it comes to domestic violence and having to fall off the workforce. It's a very, very sad situation to be in.
Sure. So, I think I try to think about ourselves as having like three buckets, right? Relationship with work, relationship with the self, and relationship with others. And at no point can we be 100% in each one. And the fact is, if we're putting a lot of it into work, these other relationships start to deteriorate. And unfortunately, with the COVID pandemic, where people began to become trapped, in lockdown, we've seen an instant rise in substance use. And we know that substance use, whether it's alcohol or something else, typically alcohol, is one of the biggest risk factors for violence, right? And for poor decision making. I mean, it naturally inhibits our decision making and executive functioning. So that leads to domestic violence as well. And then we also notice that, I think that a lot of society is not equipped, because we haven't educated them from an early age on how to actually deal with stress. And so when one becomes stressed, the outlet is to physically get it out onto somebody else. And unfortunately, when you're in a household, and most likely as nuclear households begin to, creep up, the male oftentimes is the one to start to get that physical impulse out because of the stress. So it's a really unfortunate situation, but I will also argue that, yes, females are most likely to be the victim of domestic violence. However, it also does occur in the opposite direction as well. So it's important to recognize that, because otherwise we start to stigmatize and create an environment when men can't speak out because of that, lack of psychological safety that Gopi mentioned earlier. I mean, that's key to any type of relationship, whether it's in workplace or in your personal life. That sense of psychological safety, that's what we all want and what we all seek to have at the end of the day. So, when it comes to the domestic violence, we have to think about it not only in the factors that I just mentioned, but also in other aspects. So not just physical, but emotional domestic violence and the psychological toll that can happen, which is increasing a lot more. So it's really about just recognizing and checking in, right, with one another as much as we can. It's really hard in particular to detect this emotional domestic violence that's happening, because people will, at one point, they might have felt psychologically safe and they're holding on to that still, despite things changing at home. So that's really difficult to have. So the thing that we really need to do is make sure that you as an individual, no matter if you're male or female or, however you identify, creates a very tight-knit network of those that you can check in with regularly and have accountability with, that are not necessarily just your relatives. And that way you have sort of the sounding board to go to. I don't know if this is answering your question at all, but I mean, it's a very difficult topic. And unfortunately, the rates of domestic violence have increased in the past 2 years with lockdowns. So it's really a sign for us all to say, we're not doing something right. And it's not only about putting mental health education and workshops and, promoting it in the workplace, but it's about starting to integrate it in nursery school and, in grammar school, basically, and equipping people with how to deal with stress as it comes up.
Raghu, when I had that baby panic attack yesterday, and we logged back on and we started recording, I forgot the word hygiene. I kept saying, can Dr. Thamke just jump in here? Can't you jump in here? So the word hygiene. So I'm hearing you say also the fact that mental hygiene is so important. And I'm going to stick with you because my next question is also for you. We're going to stick to the order. So how do we distinguish between the professional space and the personal space while we're overly connected at home? How do we do that? Because we're on all the time, right?
Yeah.
How do we distinguish between the two?
Yeah, I mean, I believe all four of us right now are probably at home and we're on right now. So it is really challenging. And listen, I think at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge that this is the way that things are moving. And we first need to accept that we're not going to go punch in our time card and punch out our time card and go home. We are wired, and I believe it was Abhijit who was mentioning, like, people are okay now with putting meetings at 10 o'clock at night, right? For example, like, you might have a boss that says, I'm going to put my kids down to bed and then let's meet afterwards. I mean, that's a little crazy, right? I mean, how important is that task at hand at 10 p.m. at night versus at 8 or 9 the next day? So what we need to do is be able to self-regulate for ourselves. And we have to really set those boundaries of saying, I'm actually going to be turning off at 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. and this is my time. And you really have to be very intentional about doing it. And of course, the first couple of days or weeks are going to be very challenging. But, I believe Gopi probably knows this better than I, but I believe it's like 28 days or 21 days to create a habit, right? So when you get past that discomfort, you'll eventually create a habit of it. And once you start to do it, everyone around you will start to do it, because you set the precedence that it's something that is needed for you to actually get respect and for you to have respect for others. So you do it as a leader. And what I would encourage is actually to create some accountability partners, right? Have a friend or a colleague, maybe one or two people, and say, we're going to do this together. And you start to create sort of a gamification of it. And you say, if we can do this together for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, we're going to treat ourselves to a nice dinner or to go out somewhere. And you start to create an incentive around it. And that can really help somebody. Because otherwise, it's very challenging. And we have to start to adapt to the way that we work in a modern society. But, Gopi's doing it right. I don't know what his bedtime is, but clearly it's a good time. And he's waking up early before other people. And he has that time for himself.
I think it's 5 minutes to Gopi's bedtime at this point. But I love what you highlighted, Raghu. I think we should sort of take this extract out and stick it there on the Minds Foundation page, because this is it, right? This is really it. So Gopi, coming back to you, how do we implement workplace well-being? How do we implement it?
Before I start talking in my sleep, I guess, Nina, I should probably come up with a short response to that one. Look, I think there is no easy answer or a formula. Well-being has for long been thought of as a benefit. I think Abhijit already said that. It's been thought of as a perk. Free food in the canteen, or your gym membership subscription gets reimbursed, or at best it could be your medical bills, and then you put up a poster near the water cooler. It's been that for way too long, and well-being needs to be thought of not as a benefit but as a strategy. And when you say it needs to be a strategy, it needs to be across touch points in the ecosystem, in the workplace ecosystem. What I mean by that is you can't just have it as, let's say something you do in a workshop or an offsite and be done with it. It has to permeate into the fabric of the organization. In fact, I would go to the extent of saying that well-being has to go even beyond strategy. It has to be a part of your culture. And, as it's often said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I don't know about that, but it's certainly important to make well-being a part of one's culture. So, for example, it would boil down to even simple things like how people listen to each other. How many times these days do we see people distracted, multitasking when someone's speaking to them? It's a sign of disrespect, if you ask me. And it causes stress to the person who's being spoken to if they become aware of it. How many times in meetings do we see people afraid to speak up because they're scared of being shut down? Speaks to psychological safety that we spoke of earlier. So there are a whole host of touch points. The moment we say ecosystem and touch points, there are so many of them. Starting from the leadership, which needs to be compassionate, to the way people listen within the workplace. I think well-being has to be thought of not as a benefit, not just as a strategy, but as something that's a part of the culture of the organization. It takes time, it's hard work, but it's worth it when you get there.
Gopi, I love what you've shared. And when I did the Wellbeing conference, one of the taglines that we had, we copied it from somewhere, I remember, when we were circulating the invitations. It was slow down to speed up, So I think that really has to permeate your culture. And I think not only professionally, but even personally, because I myself have noticed that when I slow down, my anxiety, even when I'm speaking, goes down drastically. Suddenly it's like, oh my God, there's no train that I have to catch. It changes everything. And it also changes, I think, the dynamic of interaction, So if I talk to you really fast, which is my default, versus when I talk to you slowly, it changes everything. And of course, I have to share with everybody, full disclosure, Gopi has been a friend and a teacher. I've done fabulous workshops with him, and Abhijit has been my coach. So hence there's this ease of conversation, and Gopi and Raghu is a friend. So I really appreciate that, the fact that we could all take the time out and have this conversation. But before we wrap up, we're going to keep you another 5 minutes. Gopi, don't fall asleep. But Abhijit, coming to you. You're an HR leader. So I'd love to know your recommendations for employers. And this is really important because we have your 800,000 followers who are going to hear about this at some point. So, so what should they keep in mind to ensure employee well-being? What should employers keep in mind?
I think, the ability to work out, we've, as we said, location has been taken care of automatically, so we are working from home. And then at some stage, we are going to sort of look at this hybrid workplace, sometimes home, sometimes office, sometimes anywhere else, etc. But I think a bigger question to really sort, which I think is the root of wellness, is to understand working hours in this world where everything is blurred and it's up for grabs again. So I think the ability to do that, back to that whole question, that 10 o'clock example is actually a real one. And, the person who was talking to me was saying that my boss, says that I need to balance my life. I have to put my kids to bed. Rightly said, somebody mentioned that. And then I can come on and sort of do the call. What about my kids? I want to sort of spend time because I wake up early and I would like to get to bed by 9 o'clock. So, my boss says, no, but I can't wake up at 5 o'clock and do this. So then we'll do it at 10 o'clock at night. So he says it's the subtle pressure of hierarchy to sort of push your work style onto others. Instead, I think you have to work out a common time which everybody's available for. And then, you begin early or begin late, whatever works for you, etc. I think some of those very elementary things need to be worked out. The other piece is, as we said, that when you look at, when somebody constantly says or notices the employees working 12 hours, 13 hours on an ongoing basis, to really shut back and say, hey, work was designed to be done in 8 hours. And, 8 and 8.5 is okay, or whatever is your fixed office hours. If it's taking consistently, if it's taking everybody more time than that, then that's a culture that we need to address. And the leaders have a bigger responsibility because they are the role models. So I think if we do these simple things, it's not that hard to do. If you do that, I think we'll begin to see a lot more of wellness. Then, of course, there are these other elements. I would say that making the opportunity to talk about mental well-being, etc., is very important. Psychological safety in the workplace, that I can tell you that, look, I'm feeling burnt out, without wondering that the moment I say this, you will replace me with somebody else. That sort of adds to the anxiety. So if we sort of respect that, I think we are going to look at a place where the manager, who has always been a knowledge worker, is now going forward, is going to become a relationship worker, which means you learn to understand how to work with emotions a lot more than just cognitive tasks. So I think that's a big shift that we are talking about, and hopefully that will happen.
Thank you, Abhijit. I think you summed it up. I made a whole list of all the points and you said them, you sort of summarized it all beautifully. I think that's wonderful. And what really sticks out to me really is psychological safety. Personally, professionally, I think it's so important. Raghu, I would love for you to make some closing remarks if you'd like.
Sure. Thank you so much. And, thanks to you and Abhijit and Gopi for joining us and supporting Minds and, celebrating DaanUtsav week with us this year. The last thing I wanted to add briefly is the concept of generative empathy. We spoke about the term empathy a bit already, but it's a concept where essentially what it means is the inner experience of sharing in and comprehending just for a moment the psychological state of another person. So essentially what it means is you're giving up your ego temporarily to really be 100% present with the person across from you. And so if leaders, and if we can even do this in our own workplace, in any of our relationships for that matter, it will just help us connect so much more. And when someone is working, 10 hours instead of 8 hours, for example, on a project, you'll be able to understand why and what's going on. There's something else underlying it that might be an obstacle for them. So I'd encourage everybody just moving forward to try to embrace this concept and try to test it out in your own life, whether it's with family or friends or someone at work. But I really appreciate everyone joining us. And I truly learned a lot. I always learn a lot from all of you. And so really glad that we've been able to stretch our time a bit and get together.
Thank you so much. It was so wonderful and effortless. Really, my anxiety, I've forgotten what my anxiety was. So thank you all for joining in. It's been such a pleasure. And to the audience, thank you for joining in. Do tune in tomorrow again at 8 p.m. where we will be talking about alternatives in terms of approaches to well-being. So thank you so much and have a good night and happy DaanUtsav.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.